Oh, that's a new one. Recording in progress. Yes, I can't see my, we were just talking about mini eggs for those of you that just joined the call. And they are deadly. There are 210 calories in 17 mini eggs, but it's very hard to limit your consumption to 17. Okay. On a more serious topic, I am very pleased to introduce Dr. Annie Duchesne today as our speaker. Feel free to tag us on Twitter if you so desire. Before I get to our bio, I wanted to acknowledge that we are presenting today from British Columbia. And that we live, work, and play and participate in the community of the unceded, ceded, and traditional territories of the 203 First Nations, among 38 Métis chartered communities, each of which possess their own unique traditions and history here on this land that we now refer to as British Columbia. We acknowledge the importance of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada's call to action, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and the BC Declaration on the Rights of the Indigenous Peoples Act. In all of our work, we are committed to ensuring Indigenous women's rights to health and safety and to the equal opportunity to participate in a manner that recognizes and respects Indigenous cultures and traditions. As I said, today I'm joining you I'm in North Vancouver, as a matter of fact, which is part of the unceded homelands of the Coast Salish peoples and the traditional territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh First Nations. So thank you so much for the privilege to be on your lands. I just wanted to really quickly say who the Women's Health Cluster are. We're now at over 250 members. I think one of our newest members is from Egypt, so we're really thankful that we're having such a broad reach. We run a number of events, including this health seminar series and a trainee research presentation series, so look out for a number of those. We give out trainee travel awards. Of course, nobody's traveling right now, but there are registration awards, and I'm thinking about some other awards we can give out too. So please stay on the lookout. We have very high success rates, much higher than NIH and CIHR. And we really need to thank our sponsors and individual donors, because without them, this series would not be possible. So hats off to University of British Columbia, Michael Smith Foundation for Health Research, CIHR, which is a Canadian Institute of Health Research, and Elizabeth Ryder, who's donated part of her sex and gender chair from CIHR to the cluster. So thank you so much to those individuals and our other individual sponsors as well. If you want to donate, you can do so on our website. And if you want to become a member, you can also do that on our website. And now we get to the heart of the matter. I'm going to stop sharing my screen so that Dr. Duchesne can, I wish I could do this en français. Parlez-vous français un peu dans la salle de bain avec le pamplemousse? Okay, there's my friend for you. Dr. Annie Duchesne is an assistant professor in the Department of Psychology at the University of Northern British Columbia. She obtained her Ph.D. in neuroscience from McGill University in 2014, where she studied the stress processes across the menstrual cycle in Dr. Jens Puschner's lab. She then did a postdoc in neuroendocrinology at the University of Toronto with Dr. Gillian Einstein, investigating the brain and cognitive correlates of surgical menopause. Dr. Duchesne's primary research interest is in understanding how hormones regulate behaviors differently across situations and individuals, with a specific focus on sex and gender. She's supported by NSERC, and she is the IGH, which is Institute of Gender and Health Trainee Network Senior Mentor at the UNBC. She's also an executive member of the Canadian Organization of Gender and Sex Research, which if you haven't heard about, please look it up. We should get a blog on that going, actually, and a board member of the Neurogenderings Network. She's an editor of a recent Frontiers in Human Neuroscience ebook called Bridging Gaps Between Sex and Gender and Neurosciences, reflecting her growing interest in integrative sex and gender research frameworks and methodology. As many of you know, I like to give a fun fact about our esteemed researchers that we have giving talks in our series. And Annie's fun fact, I've known her for quite a while, actually, and it does not disappoint. She has a passion for crows and has quite a large like absurdly large collection of YouTube videos showcasing their innovative and very funny behaviors. I'm wondering if any of those might make the talk today.
Yeah.
So without further ado, those of you, the Q&A will follow the presentation, so please feel free to put them in the chat, and please don't forget to mute yourself during the presentation. And over to you, Annie.
Yes, thank you very much, Lisa, for such a nice introduction. And I just want to really thank the network for organizing this amazing seminar series. I have watched many of those and I really thoroughly enjoy them. The students in my lab are in love with those and we discuss them. So I feel very privileged to be one of the speakers today. So before, I just want to make sure, is the visual good? Are we, okay, perfect. So I'm actually just gonna, just gonna try to move this. This is, something is happening. Sorry, I just have a problem with moving my slides somehow.
You can only show one.
Yeah, and it seemed that it doesn't, oh, okay, can I? Okay, sorry, I'm all set, excuse me. So this is the place where I am located today. So for those who don't know where UNBC is located, it is located in Prince George, but it is importantly located on the traditional territory of the Clic-les-Ténèbres. And what you're seeing is a fall picturesque view of the university. And what I highlighted here, and I don't know if everybody can see my cursor, is our Department of Psychology in the building. For those who may not know, UNBC is a small but yet research-intensive university that has actually quite varied amount of graduate programs, very interdisciplinary in nature. And in the psychology department, we do have our graduate program. So if you are interested in learning more about the research that is happening within the department and what the students are engaged in, I really encourage you to go and follow us on social media. And more generally, if you're interested in the programs, you can contact me. I will provide my contact information, but also please go and look around this beautiful institution. Okay. Another thing I really want to go through before starting my talk is really acknowledge everybody who I've worked with, been in contact with, that have inspired me, helped me forge some thoughts, ideas, and projects. And because definitely science is a collective enterprise. And before, you know, we often wait at the end, and I really want to acknowledge this at the beginning. So here are some of my collaborators, research associate students, and mentor that are related to the very projects I'm going to be talking about today. And yes, okay, oops, oh, there we go. Okay, so today's plan. So what I would like to do with you today is go over 3 main take-homes that I'm going to unpack. And hopefully by the end of my talk, you will be in agreement with the 3 take-home I'm actually going to list for you right now. Lisa, I'm looking at you and I'm like, so the first take-home that I would like you to gain as you're coming out of this talk is that interrogating stress and ovarian hormones interplay is central to understanding women's affective and cognitive processes. And that is very central. And I would say an important part of my talk will be to unpack this important statement. The second is that there are benefits to integrate gender into psychoendocrinology research program. Now I'm going to talk a bit about how to do this or how I think about doing this. And lastly, an important aspect is that gendered experience constitute a crucial source of stress that tend to occur at period characterized by variation in ovarian hormone. And this is, to me, I would say the element I've recently come to realization, and that I think it's a very important aspect, and it's really an aspect that can help us think about how sex and gender is integrated, and how can we integrate it within a psychoendocrinological program. Okay, so before I do this, I just want to have everybody's basic cover so that we're starting on a same playing field. So I'm going to give you a kind of a mini run through of the stress and stress hormones. So generally how we define stress as a reactive psychophysiological state that facilitates the development of adaptive response to the environment. What is this psychophysiological response? Well, it's a response that is orchestrated by, I would say, three main dimensions: an endocrine, an autonomic, and an affective, so a subjective response. And here you can see basically the system that is usually referred to when we're talking about the endocrine stress response, which is the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, or the HPA axis. Very briefly, I'm not going to go and describing the whole axis, although it's a very important axis, and it serves a function such that when individuals are exposed to stress, this system will be activated in response to a stressful situation, and multiple change will ensure. However, what I want you to focus on for today is one of the end product of this HPA axis, which is glucocorticoid, but cortisol in human, because over my talk, I'm going to make reference to stress hormones, and to that, I will refer to cortisol levels specifically. Second, when we talk about stress, there is a way that we characterize its experience. And one important dimension is whether we talk about acute or chronic stress. When a person experiences an acute stress, it's a stressor that is really contained in a specific period of time that has a beginning and an end. When we're referring to chronic stress, this actually experience of stress is extended over a certain amount of time. And this amount of time, depending on how you characterize chronic stress, can be a lifetime when we're talking about stressful life events. Can be a chronic stressful situation when we're talking about a situation that a person is currently living in that has a moderate level of stress, but that is really part of their ongoing situation. Or another way of characterizing stress is really when we're talking about daily hassles or daily stressors. Stressors basically that are annoyances, that are a source of discomfort, but that happen really on a daily and very frequent level. But all these facets of chronic stress have been shown to induce changes within the physiological stress system, and they are a very important dimension of stress in general. What are those events, hassles, and situations? They can be very varied. Often we distinguish them between physical and psychosocial source of stress. I would say, again, what you're going to be seeing today when we're going to referring to source of stress, it's mostly sources that are psychosocial or that are material. So basically a certain kind of hardship. But yeah, so we're not going to delve into a physical type of stressor. And finally, how to understand the effect that stress has on our body via our stress systems. One element to consider is first, these effects are called pleiotropic, and pleiotropic really refers to how widely expressed the receptors that really allows the stress system to act on our body are really expressed pretty much on all physiological systems. And however, how these effects are characterized really depends on when the stress is happening. So the timing is quite crucial, especially when we're talking about the developmental landscape, the severity of the stressful situation, its frequency. So these are important dimensions that will help us understand a bit better how stress is impacting our body. So now that I have introduced the stress, I'm actually just going to briefly go over the ovarian hormones. And I know this might be a bit, but we're going to save time in the end. We're going to be on the same page. So here is an image, a beautiful image that just encapsulates the variation in estradiol and progesterone that are going along typical woman, so to speak. And what we see here is basically a variation that is associated with the change and growth towards puberty. And what we see here is basically what characterizes the reproductively active period. However, while this looks pretty like a flat, this is not flat, but it actually reflects the cyclical activity of the menstrual cycle phase, which is basically described here. And I'm not going to get into the detail of the phase as of yet, but we'll get into this later on. But what is important is that as also we're reaching perimenopause and menopause, there is a cyclical change or variation that can be quite important. And finally, menopause occur. The axis is also very important and also includes the hypothalamic and the pituitary when it comes to the release of estrogen and progesterone. One thing that we often really focus, rightfully so, our interest on estrogens and progesterone as being the main ovarian hormones, but it's not forget that testosterone is also produced by the ovaries in a significantly smaller amount. But yes, and basically, this is our ovarian hormone in a nutshell. What I'm interested in is, however, the interplay between these two endocrine systems. And here again, I've been really fortunate to bump into a recent review that really did a nice job in just showcasing how intertwined these two axes are. And here represented, the dashed line represents the inhibitory effect, while the bolded line represents the facilitatory effect. And what you can see is basically how you have actually at different points on the axis combined facilitatory and inhibitory effect. So what you can just see from a purely visual perspective is the density of enmeshment between those two systems from an endocrine perspective. Okay, so now take home one. So interrogate the stress and ovarian hormones interplay is central to women's understandings of affective and cognitive processes. So for that, I'm going to actually unpack 3 lines of evidence, okay? The first line of evidence is relating pubertal timing and depression. So pubertal timing, as I just, and you're going to see this image a lot, so I hope you enjoyed it because it's not going to go away. So basically here, what we see is just where the pubertal timing is can be marked. And in female, in women, one very important instance that mark a change in a woman's life is the appearance of the menarche. So when the first menstrual cycle start to be activated, and when the HPA axis, the HPG axis, sorry, gets functional. So what is important here is that there's been quite of a consistent association between the time that girls have their age at menarche and the risks for depression. And this is a really consistent finding, and a finding that support that is observed in quite of a varied cohort. And I have to say, early pubertal timing is also found often associated with depressive episode or increased depressive symptoms in boys. However, what is very different is how pubertal timing in girls remain an important risk factor throughout their adolescence going into adulthood. So it seems that it's a lasting risk factor for women's depression. So an important aspect then is to try to understand how does the pubertal timing and what are the elements that may regulate the menarche and the timing of the puberty in women. And actually there is a number of very important factors that regulates pubertal timing, but one that I'm quite interested in, if you have read the take-home number 1, you should have an idea of what this factor is, and it's actually the exposure to stress. The exposure to stress and in early childhood has been associated quite consistently with an earlier age at puberty. And different type of early life adversity, ranging from maternal depression, exposure to abuse, father absence, have all been associated with an earlier age at menarche. So then it seems that what the HP axis, or the stress that is experienced earlier in childhood, really has its interactive effects on our HPG, or ovarian hormones, later in life. But what I was actually very interested or fortunate to investigate is there an association that could also be observed at the prenatal level? So is it possible that prenatal stress exposure also influence the age at menarche and pubertal timing? And I came to this question quite fortunately, because being in Montreal at that time, there is this amazing project that is led by Dr. Suzanne King, who I'm very thankful for having this collaboration with her. But what she decided to do, her very quick thought happened when the project Ice Storm comes from a very unfortunate event, which was the Ice Storm in 1998, which was a very important freezing rainfall in Quebec. So a lot of households were left without any electricity for multiple weeks. So there was a real stressful. So really this is associated to a climate, so a natural disaster type of stress. And Dr. King had this great idea to really recruiting women that were pregnant at that time and monitored their effects. So what could have happened longitudinally on the kids, and that on a various amount of physiological and cognitive domain. And there are numerous publications from the Ice Storm cohort, but one finding that was consistently observed, it's the prenatal effect of stress on metabolic function, and specifically how a greater experience of prenatal stress reported by the mother were associated with an increase in metabolic function in the children, both girls and boys. However, what we also know is that the metabolic function is another important factor of pubertal timing. So often increased metabolic function or increased adiposity is associated with an earlier age at menarche. So then when I was looking at those data and in discussion with Suzanne, I just say, well, why we're not looking at this relationship between the exposure to prenatal stress and how that could affect age at menarche, possibly directly or indirectly to a change in metabolic function. So this is a study we actually explore. And this is a bit more information just to provide a very simple figure here that just demonstrate that indeed what we found when we looked at this association was an effect of objective hardship, and objective hardship in that case really relate to how many days the mother had no phone, no electricity, no access to food, how many days. So really not the subjective experience of the stress, but literally the objective stressors or hardship that were tied to this ice storm stress. And what we found is a relationship between hardship. So hardship reported by the mother was associated to increased BMI at 5.5 years of age in the girls, which then mediated the effect on age at menarche. So importantly, we adjusted this model for numerous factors, but this is a small number of subjects. So I think it's important to note this. But what is interesting is that as of, I think, yesterday, a publication came out from the RAIN study cohort, which actually had paired of mother and daughter, I think about 1,500 pairs. And they found also an association between prenatal stress exposure and age at menarche. The pattern was not exactly the same, but there is an association that was found there. So, What is important to consider then is early life stress history when looking at the relation between pubertal timing and women's health. And if you remember, we were discussing about how pubertal timing in of itself is supposed to be a strong marker for depression. But often it's important to also account the source of that early pubertal timing, and early stress exposure is an important factor. But thinking about the interplay, it is also very important to consider pubertal timing when looking at the relation between early life stress exposure and women's health, which is also, again, a relationship that has been observed quite extensively. So really by adding these dimensions, by combining stress with pubertal timing, we are actually nuancing and exposing more complexity and ways to understand how pubertal timing could relate to girls' vulnerability to depression. Okay, oops, I'm very sorry. This is a very bad resolution. So the second point that I want to bring across is the relationship between menstrual cycle phase and stress processes. And here I'm just going to, where I put my arrow, so you have a menstrual cycle phase here, and what you see, you have basically, again, variation in estrogen, and the follicular phase, the first part of the follicular phase is characterized by very low, not very low levels of estrogens and progesterone, while as we're going to the late follicular phase, we have a rise in estradiol. And when we're going into the luteal phase, what we see is, if you're in the mid-luteal phase, it's a high level of progesterone and a fairly high level of estrogens. But when we're going towards the late follicular phase, it's decreasing level of these hormones. Okay, so now that you know, you've been walking through the visual, what I put my arrow here, it's because this is the late luteal phase. It's a phase that has been consistently associated with an increased experience of I would say stress-related and anxiety-related symptoms, and that outside of the realm of a clinical diagnosed dysphoric, so premenstrual dysphoric disorder. So I'm not talking about this specific clinical condition. I'm talking in general when people are either suffer of anxiety disorder or suffer of panic disorders, they often tend to report more instances of symptoms during that phase. So there is, again, just from the look at the association between the menstrual cycle phase and the experience of stress and anxiety related symptoms, an association that is worth investigating. And to try to understand how this relationship might occur, a lot of researchers, including myself, wanted to go or decided to go a step back and look at how stress processes might be influenced by variation in ovarian hormones across the menstrual cycle phase. And this is what I tasked myself to do for my PhD a number of years ago, and really interested to understand what is happening in the stress processes, and is there something that is really influenced by the variation in ovarian hormones, and specifically along the menstrual cycle phase. At that time, there was some evidence for an effect of the menstrual cycle phase, specifically again tied to the luteal phase, where the cortisol response to stress would be higher. However, I have to say that to this date, the results are quite inconsistent. So there are not a very clear effects on the stress levels when it comes to cortisol. And similarly, when it comes to the affective response, there are no clear effect of the menstrual cycle phase. And again, which to me doesn't really suggest that there is no effect, but it suggests that, unsurprisingly, maybe the relationship is a bit more complex than established. Okay, so what you're seeing here is, in a nutshell, an important findings that I demonstrated in my PhD thesis. So when I exposed women to a standardized stressor, which very, very frequently is the TSST. So the TSST is Again, a social evaluative stress, something that looks a lot like what I'm doing currently. Although, you know, if Lisa would look really not so agreeable. Yeah, exactly. This is the kind of TSSD. No, but the idea here is that you're providing an evaluative yet ambiguous environment, which is sufficient to really induce a significant, fairly consistent cortisol stress response, as well as really subjective response. I did not find significant effects in the amount of either the affective nor the cortisol response when people were exposed to this social evaluative stressor. However, when starting to look at how these dimension of stress relate to one another, an effect of the menstrual cycle came up. And this is the effect, which is basically the relation between the affective stress response, so how people reported, so their subjective experience of stress. The more they reported stress, if you find my cursor here, the more they reported stress, the lowest the level of cortisol were in the follicular phase. However, in the luteal phase, this association was opposite. And for me, this was very interesting because in the stress literature, we know that the subjective, affective, and the physiological are very important dimension of the stress process. And probably everybody would assume that these are going hand in hand in terms of how they are associated to one another. But actually, it's far from the truth. There are often little association between the way a person feels subjectively when they're stressed and their physiological response. So here, what was interesting is that by being attentive to the menstrual cycle phase, we could reveal an association that is often absent. This was done, and again, being perfectly honest, my first study that done the monitoring of the menstrual cycle was not the best. So I ran another study when we used a different type of stressor, the Montreal Imaging Stress Test, which is a social evaluative stress, but done in the scanner. We found the same relationship between the two different groups using a different type. So instead of the affective stress response, it was the state self-esteem as they came out of the stressor, but the association remained the same. And we even further extended this association to basically how the cortisol response was differently associated with brain activity during the stress task. Okay, so this is it. Now I'm going to show you another similar yet slightly different finding. That's not coming from me, but that's coming from Jennifer Gordon at U of Regina, and where she actually was very interested to look at perimenopausal estradiol variation, because Jennifer Gordon developed a very interesting framework to try to understand why there is an increase in depression and depressive symptomatology in women around the perimenopause. And her take was that this increased variation in estrogens is actually making women more vulnerable to the effect of stress, or making them more stress sensitive, which would render them more prone to develop, to have increased depressive symptoms and possibly depression. So she actually followed a number of women and was able to differentiate them on how much they varied in their estradiol level and created group. So here, when you see low estradiol and high estradiol, it means that high, it's high variation, and low, it's low variation, but we're talking about variation here. And then she looked at how much their stress or depressive symptoms were influenced by this, if actually there could be a difference. And actually, if you look at everybody and you're not attentive to another variable that was very important, you don't find a difference. A difference was revealed when you paid attention to chronic stressful life events. So when we looked at women with high variation in estradiol, who were also exposed to a lot of stressful life events, this is where the difference was observed. So if you can see here, this is really a typical example of a moderation. So the stressful life events moderated how variation in estradiol was related to depressive symptomatology. Okay, so what we have here, menstrual cycle phase moderate relationship between the affective and endocrine response. Also, exposure to chronic stress life events moderate the relationship between perimenopausal estradiol variation and depressive symptoms. So here again, we have, by being attentive to the interplay between these two systems, we're revealing what is happening, or the association that happens at the psychological and specifically affective level. Okay, I have to be mindful of time because I'm somebody who talks a lot. So here is the last piece of evidence. So I'm sorry, I said 3, but it's actually 4 line of evidence. So basically, here we're talking about the ovarian and stress hormones and how they are impacting learning and memory. And here an important body of literature, really, and a body of literature that has important clinical implication is how variation, or how the loss of ovarian hormones associated with the menopause is actually associated with cognitive impairment, specifically with memory function. However, as I'm saying this, again, this finding is not a straightforward, and actually the effect, or how ovarian loss is associated to difference in memory, learning and memory, is contingent to other variable. And one variable that seems to be really influencing this relationship is the type of menopause and when this menopause occurred. And as I said, as Lisa said, I've done this beautiful postdoc in Dr. Gillian Einstein lab, and I was fortunate enough to study how the surgical menopause that happens before the window of the natural menopause, so usually prior 52 years of age. So women who had an ovarian loss due to this surgery actually found or have significant change in their memory, specifically working memory function. And this effect was not observed when they are taking estradiol or estrogen. And here you have the reference of the beautiful publication by Nicole and this entire group of amazing people, if you want to learn more about it. But what is also interesting is that stress is having almost a positive effect than the effect of estradiol when it comes to working memory. And it's pretty consistently observed that exposure to stress is really going to impair working memory. However, what is interesting is that if a woman, and in that very study, when women were taking estradiol and stressed, the effect of stress of working memory was mitigated by the use of estradiol. So there is definitely an interplay. And what is very interesting when it comes to learning and memory is that this interplay seems to be in opposing fashion. So the effect of stress is maybe pulling to a certain direction, that the effect of ovarian hormones might actually be pulling in another direction. I'm very aware that I'm maybe overly simplistic, but just for sake of carrying my message through, we can discuss that further. So what I'm currently very interested in, and unfortunately COVID has been challenging our ability to carry these projects, but is how ovarian hormones and stress specifically interact and impacting learning strategy. And this is, again, a great work that my current master students will undergo fairly soon. But the idea here, and what I want you to capture, is that there are ways of going about the world and learning about our environment. And these can be observed when you're navigating a space, when you're making decision about how to move or how to search things, or when you're making prediction about is an event going to happen based on previous experience. And all of these, while they're very different action, they are tied to a balance between two strategies that we can call the cognitive versus the habitual strategy. And these two strategies, the cognitive usually really allows you to develop more of a model of the world and have a bit more cognitive flexibility when you're learning and making decision about orienting yourself, choosing to exploit or explore an environment, while the habitual is a system that is more closely tied to a stimulus response, so one outcome, and then producing a response to a specific outcome. And then while the system is often, learning is known to be faster, it's also known to be a bit less flexible and a bit more rigid. What is important, everybody is using those two systems all the time. But what is really key, though, is that when you're stressed, the balance is shifting of those systems. And that is one finding that has been fairly consistently found in the human literature, such that when you're actually being stressed, the habitual learning strategy is favored over the cognitive. What is also very interesting, and that has been done mostly, that has been heavily done in research in rodent, is that estrogen is doing the opposite. It's actually tilting the learning strategy in favor of a cognitive strategy. And what is really important is that thus far, there has not been extensive research in humans that have actually characterized this effect on ovarian hormones, but there has been some. And so far, there's 2 studies, and their effects are not totally consistent. But based on, let's say, the animal literature, we're really interested to see if the effect of ovarian hormones in combination with the stress, how this will move the learning strategy preference. So this is ongoing, unfortunately. So I don't have any results for it, but I have a lot of enthusiasm. So, okay. Stress exposure, stress hormones modulate the development of, so stress exposure hormones modulate the development, circulating level, and psychological correlates of ovarian hormones. Ovarian hormones regulate stress processes. So the study of stress and ovarian interplay may provide insight into some inconsistencies that are often observed in both the stress and the ovarian research field, so to speak. So developing a comprehensive understanding of stress exposure is very important. As well, developing a comprehensive understanding of ovarian hormone exposure is very important. Okay, so now I have to check my time. Oh, boy. Okay, I can do this. Take home 2. There are benefits to integrate gender into psychoendocrinology research. This is an infographic that I'm enormously familiar, that I've benefited enormously, and that I actually really, to me, as a produce of the IGH, a scholar that has really been trained in sex and gender research since its early Ph.D. years. This is basically portraying the sex and gender related variables that constitute us as being on the spectrum of being a man, a woman, or none of the others. But they are important. It's important to lay them out because they do have important effects. And I've just actually showcased how ovarian hormones, they're very important, especially when we're looking at them in interaction with stress. However, when we think about individual, we all know that when I'm studying myself, we also are gendered and sex individual. And there is this enmeshment of these 2 components. And this is really, and often when we're talking about difference between men and women, people do refer at sex/gender differences because of this enmeshment of these constructs. But to me, while I recognize that and totally understand it, as a researcher, I think it's really important to say, can we actually, instead of doing sex or gender or sex/gender, do sex with gender? So I have been very tormented to try to find ways or think about this. And kind of a bit clueless was, I've been very interested in reading. So in a need for a friend, you do what? You call a special issue on the very topic that you would like to have a better understanding. And this is what I did with a really numerous great editors that were on this project. And the call was very simple: bridging gaps between sex and gender in neuroscience. It cannot be clearer. This is what we were after. And actually, we got 17 great publications that really showcase also the variety of how people think about bridging. What does it mean to bridge sex and gender? And this was a very instructive exercise for me. One paper that really caught my attention, and I'm going to go briefly, is this beautiful small contribution that just does gender leave an epigenetic imprint on the brain. And it was a commentary or an opinion piece that just tried to provide us to think about how gender, from an epigenetic perspective, so epigenetics being the modification of gene expression by change in the epigenome. So can gender experience influence our brain and our biology through epigenetics? And this was a great exploration, but what I left with is actually a plan to try to study gender and to try to implement gender and focusing on gendered experience. And they started giving me some keys here. And one of them, it's chemical exposure. And chemical exposure, what it refers to is that men and women, the way they are engaged in life, the way they are known to treat themselves, their surroundings, they are exposed to different sources of chemical. And one example is the personal care products would be a very typical example, but also gender occupation. And this is really, again, gender occupation, the kind of products, cleaning products versus industrial products. So there are differences there. And those chemicals are acting, lots of them are having endocrine effects, and lots of them actually mimic the effect of estrogen. So unfortunately, I'm just going to leave you hanging there. And if you have more questions, you're welcome to ask. But I'm just going to tell you that I've started really engaging myself in trying to understand this chemical aspect as a way of getting more gender into an endocrinology program. The other thing that I was really left with is this other gendered experience. And I was like, ooh, okay, here it is. I'm going to try to find these other gendered experience. And to do that, I had to switch or modified or actually operate with a different definition of gender. So the definition of gender that has been provided that a lot of people will operate by is the socially constructed roles, behavior, expression, and identities of girls, women, and boys, men, and gender diverse people. So this is a great definition, but one thing that is missing from this definition is how these differences are also different in terms of the power and value that these gendered behavior have. So there is an inherent power dynamics in how gender is construed and conceptualized. And this is very important, especially if you are a researcher interested in stress. So the sociostructural processes leading to social identity construction that perpetuate women and gender diverse people inferiority status. This is, to me, a definition of gender that I think really showcase some of the dimension of gender that could be of relevance to extract gendered experience for our study. And then once you have this definition of gender, for me, it became very clear that women gendered experience can be also understood as stressful experience. And how we go to find these gendered experience. And this is where I found the socio-ecological model very useful. Because again, these experience, so what the socio-ecological model provides in a nutshell is the interdependence of multiple social facets. So from the societal to the individual, you have these systems, these social systems that are interdependent and that will inform each of those systems themselves, but also the individual specifically. And to me, this is just an example that has been used to try to understand violence against women. And you can see the example, but to me, this is the framework we use to think about gendered stress experience. And very briefly, I'm going to show you some of our preliminary early work on the gendered source of chronic stress. And this is basically some of the chronic stress, and I can ask if you have questions, gendered profession, comment on physical appearance, instance of sexual harassment, instance of emotional labor, gender-based discrimination. These are all very important elements. Another important element at the individual level is worrying about your physical safety, your physical appearance, your social adequacy, which actually comes from these social experiences. Another aspect when you think about gender is early puberty. Early pubertal timing, as I mentioned, is really related to developmental stress exposure. But early pubertal timing from a gender perspective is a source of stress. There is increased sexual harassment, increased peer rejection, increased sexual rumor, decreased body self-esteem that are also correlated with, that act as a source of stress. Okay, can I do this very rapidly? Another very important gender source of stress, menstruating stigma. And again, that I'm actually not going to talk about it because Kieran is writing a beautiful blog that's going to be shared. But the idea is to say these are experiences that can be understood as stress that are tied to our very gender. Okay, what could be a gendered psychoendocrinology? This is my claim. Well, this gender, she's like, oh my God. Well, it recognized that every physiological phenomenon is socially embedded and therefore influence individual psychoendocrinology. Also recognize that women's gendered experience are rooted in power imbalance, therefore constituting significant source of stress. The social interpretation of women's physiological processes is an added level of causality that can influence these very physiological processes. So what I'm saying here is that the gendered experience we live, the social experience, especially when you think about them in stress, can actually change the very circulation of your ovarian hormones. It is possible. It's something we can contemplate and definitely investigate. Clinical significance. Reposition the notion of vulnerability and resilience from an individual to a social level. So by actually showing all of these different gendered experiences, we are also seeing different opportunity to interact and intervene when it comes to understanding point of resilience that are not just with the individual, but with the entire society as well. And that is a nice way to really leverage social change. And finally, I just want to end by saying gendered psychoendocrinology next. Consideration for intersecting social identities. And this is a limitation of this very brief framework, but I have to say, I have thought about it. I'm thinking about it, and I wrote a paper about it. So it's just under revision, and it's going to come very soon. But I think that if you were thinking about this as you were going to this talk, I'm with you and I understand. So now, thank you very much. This is it.
Wow. Well, I mean, fantastic. If you care to, please do the little emoji. Just before Dr. Duchesne's talk, she said, I don't know if you're gonna like it. And I just have to say, I'm like, you blew my mind, actually. When you think about that transdisciplinary science, and that's just a melding together of, I know you know what it means, I'm saying it for the other people, but melding together of different disciplines, I think you nailed it. And I mean, I have a lot of questions, but it would take way more than the 7 minutes we have left to really delve into it. But I mean, you really, like, I need on the screen, I need, we have those reactions. I want one of those ones, that emoji with the mind blown. That's what I need right now.
Well, thank you. That's great.
I really enjoyed it. It really made me think. I mean, I wrote down a really basic question, and then you started going on about your gendered neuroendocrinology. So now it seems like a silly question, but and I should look in the chat because I'm supposed to be moderating that. But if people have any questions, please feel free to put it in the chat or unmute yourself and ask it. So my basic question was, even when we're thinking about like the TSST, and okay, male female, that's great, and we just did one with the TSST and mild cognitive impairment versus normal aging, and I thought, oh, that's good, we've got all these different groups we're looking. But you don't often think about, I know some people do, but often think about how that acute stress falls on top of chronic life stress, right? So an acute stress could act very differently if you're a stressed out individual, whether or not that's from gendered experiences that you've had very recently or throughout your life? So I mean, that's a pretty basic question compared to all the amazing things that you were talking about there.
No, it's a crucial, I have to say, it's a crucial question. And I think you're spot on by seeing this. And it's a kind of a, let's be honest, it's a kind of a paradox, because we are thinking about chronic stress. We're saying these are, one comes from the other, and your propensity to respond acutely is totally contingent on your experience of chronic stress. So I would say the smaller, faster answer to this from my own research when I was doing stress, we always accounted for, and we always accounted for chronic stress. And if we were doing group differences, we looked if the stress exposure was actually the same, but we never looked at necessarily the moderating effect of chronic stress. And it's very interesting you're saying that, because the first honor projects I ran with my students here at UNBC was a reanalysis of my part of my PhD data, specifically looking at the moderating effect of chronic stress, specifically also because the Jennifer Gordon's paper that I just presented. Unfortunately, we did not find any moderating effect, but for me, I feel like now the type of chronic stressor that we add was probably also, it was different than, it was not stressful life events, it's the tics, which ask more about your perceived experience of chronic stress. But I agree, and I think that we do in our current answer project, the chronic stress is a focal point of this also research to try to really characterize the two, and actually how these may vary by variation in the menstrual cycle, for instance.
Yeah, I was just thinking when you were talking about, the perceived, and you talked a little bit about that, like the perceived stress versus the objective measures of stress. And now I'm also thinking about like perceived gendered experiences versus objective measures. So and if you bear with me, I don't know if this is going to be make a lot of sense or not, but in academia, I've been to a number of workshops, doing another one very soon about gendered experiences in academia. And it's interesting because every once in a while, someone will say, and usually a woman, oh, I haven't never experienced that. Like I haven't personally myself experienced that. And it always strikes me as an interesting comment, because I've had so many, I don't even want to write them down, because I think people think that I'm lying in terms of those sort of those little, knockdowns that you get all the time. So I'm wondering, how can you get at that sort of, we can ask how stressed you are. I guess you can ask the same kind of question. How gendered do you feel? That's not how you'd ask it, but have you thought about that, sort of the subjective and objective measures?
I think that this is, to me, and I have to say, it's kind of funny because I think you've kind of nailed the two most fundamental kind of point of controversy also, and how I juggle my own research, and how at the same time you want to have the person's experience, but you also want to have the person's exposure. And sometimes the person's experience is not the best judge of the person's exposure. And this is again kind of always a very important nuance and a very important elements to juggle. So when it comes to gendered experience, and let's say stressful gender experience, and I think I just want to point that here I'm literally talking about the social experience that are done on individual because they're labeled as women. I'm not talking about how one identify with one gender, just so that it's extra clear. But then I would say, to me, that's why when we start doing this chronic stress inventory, or we add a lot of instances, I think if we were to ask women, what are the sources of stress, nobody would say, I clench my jaw slightly when I go to my parking lot at night because I'm really not feeling safe. I've been checking myself in my jeans 17 times during the day, because, these are not because it's actually normal. It's part of our,
it's just the way we are.
Well, yeah, the way, yeah, but I feel like this is an interesting aspect, and that's why I feel the next step in these gendered experiences also to really get focus group, to also have, because the literature is bringing us, and I have to say in that case, the feminist literature is a very rich literature to pinpoint those where those source of unattended gendered stress might be happening.
Man, you're blowing my mind. I'm telling you. I love it. I love all about it. It can't all be about me and what I love, though. I totally understand that, but I'm certain, even though there's not a lot of cameras on, that people are also nodding their head. There are a number of comments in the chat, so that's why I just wanted to turn our attention to them. One of them is to show that chart again on the navigation of habitual versus, but there's not a question associated with it. But one thing I wanted to mention was, in the animal literature, you can turn to it if you want, but in the animal literature, it is true that estradiol seems to shift to the sort of more spatial, but they're not always as good. But that's the other little.
Yeah, this is, and I think this is a key point, and that's why I'm saying, like, this is a shift, but it's not a shift that is tied to a the things are, the performance is not change all, even in the stress individual, their performance does not change. Their preference change.
Right. Which is really interesting. No, that's really, really interesting. Okay, well, I'm mindful that is now 1. So I guess I shouldn't really. There is one other thing here, but I don't quite understand. And Alicia, if you want to unmute yourself and quickly ask the question, I'm happy for it. I noticed that taking OCPs, oral contraceptives, maybe helped blunt the acknowledgement of all these minor knockdowns, but perhaps it was a lack of monthly visual reminder of gender. Hi, Alicia, did you want to say something out loud or no?
Sorry, no, it wasn't a question. That was a really lovely presentation. Thank you so much.
Thank you
for exploring that topic. It was just an observation that I, within a male-dominated field, where what you said about micro knockdowns and all of that, it took me a number of years to recognize that was probably the source of why I felt that my career wasn't moving forward at the same rate as my male colleagues. And like you said, sometimes, because the individual doesn't perceive it doesn't mean that it's not there. But right. I did wonder if it, after stopping oral contraceptives, if maybe that had somehow blunted the ability to recognize these direct or indirect aggressions.
Mm.
Yeah, that's also another really interesting idea.
Yeah. And to me, I think that's the beauty of when you can find a way, kind of an angle to include this degree of social experience and then interrogate it with variation in hormones. You can really come with, again, I would say, very nice and nuanced projects. To me, I found it as a very generative framework. You can have a lot of new questions. And I think this is one that's very interesting.
Okay, so I'm sorry, I have to cut us off, but I'm really like, I'm trying to think of the right word, but I don't know, I'm really pumped up. I can't think of anything but stimulated, pumped up. I'm sure there's a better word. And it sounds like there are other people too and so I'd love to continue the conversation and see how the cluster could help with some of that. So so let's keep the conversation going. I think this is really, really interesting. I'm really excited to see what your lab comes up with next, but thank you so much.
Thank you for having me. And I think thank you for like, to me, there was a breaking an ice to integrate all of this together. And I really felt very safe and welcome to do so. So
you're always safe. Yeah, you were a little worried about, I was like, no, I loved all of it. Every single bit, I love it. So if everybody can join me in thanking either of you.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you, everybody. And if you have questions, don't hesitate also to email me. And again, this was very trailblazing. I'm happy to engage in more conversation or questions. This is something I really enjoy anyway. So really a good change from COVID.
I know, getting excited about something. It's great. Besides the vaccines. All right. With that, we should say goodbye. Thank you so much.
Yeah, my pleasure.